Welcome to the latest episode of Cause for Thought podcast, the short episodes. And this time we have a change. The hunter becomes the hunted. I've swapped positions. So it's me, Jonathan Batchelor, from What Caused This, hosting the podcast this time with George Holman, the standard and elite podcast host, as the guest for today. So welcome, George, and welcome to the slightly different hot seat.
Thank you for the warm welcome, John. I am a little bit apprehensive about the grilling that I'm going to be given, but looking forward to it.
Well, no need to worry, George. I've decided not to chuck in an icebreaker in your normal style because I couldn't think of one that was kind.
Okay, very kind of you.
So I think, having been in your seat for a couple of these short story episodes, and I actually quite enjoyed telling them as well because it brings some things to mind that I'd forgotten about, actually, linked to the world that we work with. So I guess all I'm going to say is, George, what's your story?
So I've got a story today, John, that relates back to my time working in financial services risk management. And it relates to reconciliations. And for anyone that's not familiar with reconciliations, in a banking context, what we mean is it's basically just comparing data sets, comparing information to make sure that hopefully they're all aligned. And if there are differences, giving you the ability to be able to investigate kind of, those differences. So the example I'm going to speak about today is something I look back on as a story of where something couldn't possibly go wrong, or could it? So a bank that I was working with ran a critical three-way reconciliation. So it was comparing three different sets of data. On paper, the setup was flawless. So what I mean by that is the team's most experienced analyst had designed the rec themselves. Full disclosure, it was an EUC, so it was like an Excel-based rec, but it had been designed really well by someone in the know. All three of the data feeds going into the rec were clean and timely, and users on an ongoing basis completed every step exactly as they were asked and exactly as required. But despite this, and you can tell there's a but coming.
I felt the but coming, George.
I'm sure. The firm suffered a material financial loss, and I'm talking multi-million pound losses, when a series of reconciliation breaks went undetected until month end. Now, an incident investigation was launched, and for anyone unfamiliar with my background, I used to work in the risk team. I actually led the risk team, and I was brought in to facilitate this investigation. At first, every discussion that we had, and we had workshops, we had, this was when things were done in the office, it wasn't done virtually, so everything was in person. But every discussion went back to the same culprits over and over again. And you and I, John, will have heard these things multiple times, irrespective of industry. So it must have been human error. The rec must not have been run correctly. There must have been timing differences. And also, why don't we just automate it? However, so the experienced analyst, I'll keep them nameless for the purposes of this story, who had designed the rec, defended the process every single time we came around to this conversation. So saying things like the logic is sound, I built it to handle all possible scenarios, etc., all different types of trade types.
That's a great phrase, isn't it?
Exactly. And the rest of the team, and this is where it gets really interesting, John, the rest of the team, out of respect for this person's expertise, followed their lead. But as you dug in a little bit, as I dug in a little bit, the inconsistencies didn't really fit the narrative that he and they were describing. So during one session, I, in my role as facilitator, asked the group, does this reconciliation rely on any static data? Everyone kind of looked around at each other, slightly puzzled and perplexed, but the analyst who designed the rec suggested not. So I thought, I'm not quite convinced, so I tried to dig a little deeper. And I asked them quite directly, what market data underpins this reconciliation? and how is it refreshed? And when we talk about market data, it's typically something that is brought in from an external vendor that contains product pricing and curves that help you value products and trades that you might have.
Right.
And across the group, you could see a hesitance to answer kind of was created, and a silent period followed until someone rather sheepishly said, we don't pay for a live data feed. We download the data in a snapshot, in a flat file, once a month, and we store it down locally. And John, you can probably see where this is going.
Well, at least it was correct at one point in time.
Right. So it's correct once a month, but then for the rest of the month, you're pretty sure it's going to be stale. We dug a little deeper, and that decision had been made years and years before, primarily to save budget. And it was the linchpin reason, the cause of the incident, that they had made a decision to save money on bringing in market data every single day. And then a reconciliation had been built in good faith, using good process and good kind of ideas, on top of what was essentially a fairly short-term decision upstream of the team. The short kind of the end of this story is that the fact that they were using this static snapshot meant that valuations of their products were often weeks and weeks out of date, and that inherently created mismatches across all three legs of the reconciliation. So it was going to always be very difficult to correctly get this reconciliation to run. So it turns out the breaks weren't caused by users or timing or, a lack of automation. They were caused by stale, unrefreshed data that the process depended on. So the root cause wasn't negligence.
From a commercial minded point of view, which is where I tend to operate from, I'm sort of trying to put those two things in parallel columns of the cost of subscribing to the live data and the perceived cost, not the price, but the perceived cost of that, and then the actual cost of the error.
Exactly.
That's quite stark, isn't it? But the decision wasn't made for any wrong reason, really, at the time, was it? And probably signed off by multiple people.
That's right.
But I mean, when you look at those two figures next to each other, it's quite a warning, isn't it, for where we see value against cost?
It is. And look, to get into a little bit of human psychology, what was going on here was something that we refer to as the endowment effect. So basically, in simple terms, if you feel like you own something and you've owned it for a period of time, it becomes quite hard to relinquish it, to view it any differently than positive. So the experienced analyst, and by extension their team, because they didn't want to, make him look silly or potentially wrong, unconsciously overvalued the original design of the reconciliation because they had created it. He had created it.
Yeah, and maybe that happened over time because they'd used it many, many times and there hadn't been an issue. So it becomes more valued and more, in their eyes, more robust.
Exactly.
Every use.
And every time you use it, every time you feel that sense of ownership, you think, not for any kind of nefarious reason, but you think that the data feeding it and therefore the reconciliation is fit for purpose.
Absolutely.
So the outcome, thankfully, once they were able to move to a dynamic feed for market data and added in controls around data quality as well, those specific types of breaks stopped almost immediately and overnight.
I love that story, George. One point I'd like to pick up on, and there's so many I want to talk about. I love that stuff. But you talk about the endowment effect. So I'm aware of effects in business like that. I didn't actually know the name, but now I do know the name. How could businesses overcome that endowment effect? Because it's going to be present in so many.
Yeah, so it's one of those natural senses or things that lives within all of us, right? It's an instinct that we have. So it's not about trying to kind of force that out of our psyche, but when we're dealing with problem solving, to try and overcome it, I would suggest three things. One, I would say try to separate identity from ideas. So people tend to defend something that they've built because changing it inherently feels personal. It feels like you're admitting defeat. So as leaders, we should always try to encourage the mindset that we are testing the process here, not the person. I think you made the point, John, things change over time. Let's accept that. Let's review things through that lens rather than having that feeling of pointing fingers at the person.
It doesn't mean the first thing we did was wrong. It means it might not be right now. There's a big difference there.
And it could have been right then, and now it's just become stale because of something else that was changed elsewhere. And that really frees teams, organizations, and individuals to challenge their own assumptions without jumping to the need to feel defensive, right? The second thing I would say is try to build what I refer to as assumption audits into investigations. Now, that sounds really stuffy, and all I mean by that is we should ask, are there things that we are treating as truth that either we're not validating or haven't been validated before, and therefore we need to look at them a little bit harder? And it avoids that temptation to rely on assumptions, particularly where those things have been around for such a long time, right? So we might have
verbally challenge them, George, as well. If we say them out loud, we're trying to understand that every time something happens, will it cause an effect? Every time, no matter what. And
absolutely,
when you start to think about those things, they may have understood that actually we may have a slight issue here because the data may be 28 days old.
Exactly. And that really does then, to your point, John, it starts to surface the design choices, the things that you decided to build on that back in the day were correct, and they were done thoughtfully and purposefully, and they were signed off. And in this scenario, the market data choice was made, and it was probably correct, and it was signed off, and it went through the right level of governance. But the two things weren't considered in tandem, and therefore, both were made probably in blissful ignorance of the other, right? So you automatically have that bias thinking, and that's where having that concept of an assumption audit can help. It helps you to get more idea. To the the crux of why something may have been done.
Write assumption audit in my notes, George.
You can have that one. And then the third kind of tip that I would suggest, and this is something that we talk a lot about in root cause analysis, is to introduce fresh perspectives into conversations and to try and break that ownership bias that we all have. As I said, this is an instinct that we have based on our human need to have things, to own things. So bringing someone into a problem-solving root cause analysis conversation that can bring objectivity and challenge. We sometimes refer to them as the professional idiot, and I'm just going to wait for you to say something like, George, you can probably play that role quite easily.
Not saying it out loud, George.
Thinking it, but that's fine. But a person's distance from their subject matter, from the focal point, they don't have the emotional pull that someone who's right in the eye of the storm, right in the middle of something, or who has designed something, has owned something, will have. And removing that emotional pull can help to tackle the endowment effect. And
they don't bring a bias into the room with them, do they? There is no bias there to bring.
Their mission statement, as my role was in this problem-solving kind of exercise, was to fix the problem, but to do that, to identify the cause, come up with a solution and move the business forward, not to be overly wedded to one thing or another. And we find that by having that, professional idiot, someone who in there who's objective, isn't going to be fixated on an outcome walking into the room, that can help you to open up new causal pathways.
I love it, George. I'm just sitting here thinking how many current financial services institutions are operating with a stale data feed now because of a cost of subscription.
Absolutely.
That's something I'd love to find out. Well, I'd also never heard of an endowment effect before this podcast, and I've now written down an assumption audit. So everyone in What Caused This is going to be looking forward to the next team meeting there, aren't they, George? When I roll these out as if they're my own phrases. Well, thank you for sharing your first story on your debut appearance as a guest on Cause for Thought Shorts, George. I've really enjoyed it, so much so I might even host another. Do you want to do another?
Why not?
Lovely. Well, there we are, Cause for Thought Shorts, hosted by me, Jonathan Batchelor, with a guest, George Holman. See you soon, everybody. Cheers, George.
Thank you.